Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of DarshanTalks. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. As you know, it's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. And part of that is talking to really smart people like the guests we have today. I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA regulated products. So if you have an interest in an FDA regulated company or its products, this is the podcast for you. So today's podcast is really kind of interesting. We are going to potentially talk about things like globalization. We're going to talk about privacy. We might end up talking about artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things. So if that doesn't keep you at the edge of your seat, I don't really know what will. Our guest for today is the global privacy team lead at Beckage. She's a professor of law at Drexel University. She is a lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley School of Information. She's an author, she's a speaker, and she is on media all the time. So our guest for today, Jordan Fisher. Hey, Jordan.
Hi, Darshan. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. We had a very brief discussion before we started on what your last 48 hours looked like. And my experience is that your last 48 hours is what people's careers look like. So
it feels that way sometimes.
So it sounds like you're doing some really cool things. So let's start with some of the easier things, that, if you will. There was a recent guidance proposed guidance from the EU, and it talked about artificial intelligence. So before we get into what the proposed guidance really talked about, could you talk a little bit about what is artificial intelligence? When do these rules kick in? Because is a chatbot artificial intelligence? Most people would agree it's not. But then you get those weirdos who do think that maybe that should count. So what is artificial intelligence? What is the cutoff? And when do these rules start kicking in?
Yeah, so those are great questions. And I don't think we have a clear legal understanding of what we are going to determine is artificial intelligence, which is going to add to the complexity of the laws around artificial intelligence. So I think we should start out level setting with artificial intelligence is what we think it is, but we don't necessarily have a defined term. So it's sort of creating models using technology to make decisions that we would normally expect human beings to make. So there's artificial intelligence when it comes to scanning data sets and sort of understanding what those data sets say. Where it starts to get a little more scary or a little more impactful on us is when that AI starts to make determinations about us. Are we going to be able to get a loan from a bank? Are we going to be insurable? Both health insurance or business insurance, et cetera. And I wouldn't say that AI, I always feel like AI is this buzzword. And it is certainly being used. I don't want to say it's not being used, but I think it's still very much in its experimental phase. But what we see is we understand that by giving a computer the capability to make decisions we would normally expect a human to make, we do need to understand the impact of that. If they're going to start making decisions that have legal ramifications on us, like getting a loan, or whether or not we can do certain things, whether we can get employment, right? So like AI is being tested in the employment context, et cetera. So, there's a lot of interest at the legislative level, both in the United States, globally, in the European Union, to make sure that this doesn't get so far afield that we start to allow AI to make decisions. And then all of a sudden we go, whoa, we don't really want that to happen. That was not intended. So we're trying to get ahead of it. So what we see in the European Union, and this is in the last 24 hours, is the EU has a proposed artificial intelligence regulation. So a little primer on EU law. A regulation is basically a law that's going to apply across the entire EU. It doesn't require member states to adopt it within their legislation. It doesn't require member states to do anything. By virtue of the regulation being adopted at the EU level, it is going to be the law across all of the European Union, as opposed to things like directives, which direct the member states to adopt laws implementing the goals of the directive. So it's a little bit different when you're looking from a legal perspective. So to understand, in the last 24 hours, we have a proposed regulation. So we do not have an adopted regulation. There's no date when it goes into effect. What we have is the EU signaling to technology companies, to businesses, one, we are looking at AI very seriously. We understand that there are benefits to AI, but we also understand that there could be corresponding risks to us as individuals with AI. And two, this is how we're thinking of regulating it. This is not how we're going to regulate it. This is how we're thinking of regulating it. So now what we'll go through is a little bit of a public comment period. We'll have discussions around it. There could be changes to the law. There could not be changes to the law, right? So it could actually be adopted in its current form. But this is sort of a great place if you are in AI, if you are considering AI, if you're just interested in it from an academic perspective, to sort of see how one legislature, the EU, is sort of attempting to approach what it is going to mean to have AI from a legal perspective.
So that raises a few different questions for me. So first of all, this is the EU putting out a proposed regulation. Is there an opportunity, like with the FDA, to actually influence that? And is it done at the member state level, or is it done at an individual or a company level?
So certainly there are opportunities to engage in dialogue with the EU legislatures around proposed regulation. I'm not going to get into the whole how EU adopts a law because it's much more confusing than that cute cartoon we have in the United States. Although I would welcome anyone who wants to make an EU version of that cartoon. But there's complexities to it. But in short, there are certainly opportunities, either formal opportunities. They don't call it notice and comment like we do in the United States, but the traditional notice and comment period is certainly an opportunity to present more formal comments to the regulation, to engage in that. There's also, just like the United States, there are lobbyists who work either on behalf of industries or on behalf of certain companies to work with legislatures around those proposed regulations. So we will, I'm sure, see a fair amount of conversation, both within the business level, but then also just in responses to that proposed regulation. And that's actually going to be really interesting from an industry perspective. Who responds, who engages on it is kind of going to be telling as to who's really interested in AI and who's really focused on this. And so usually those notice and comment periods is similar again to the United States. We're talking 60, 90 days. And then there's a back and forth on that. And often they can be very valuable because they can point out areas where there just is not going to be a capability to comply with it, or it just is misinterpreting technologies, et cetera. So they can be very valuable exercise to go through.
Which really raises the question that this is where I think your experience and your expertise really starts shining, because this is and we haven't even gotten into what the law actually allows for, or the proposed reg, to be even clearer, what the proposed reg even suggests. But well, why don't we actually just explore that before we get into my questions associated with it? So can you tell me a little bit, or tell us a little bit about what they're coming out and saying in this proposed regulation?
So what they're really trying to do at a global level, and everyone's still digesting it, so within those first 24 hours, it's hard to really comment deeply on any proposed legislation. But what they're really trying to do is, one, frame the conversation around what's going to be considered AI, what's not going to be considered AI, and sort of the go, no-go areas of AI. Where are we going to be comfortable having technology make determinations, and where are we not going to be comfortable? How are we going to address things like AI bias? Right? Because machines have bias, especially because those of us who create the machines insert our bias into those machines, unfortunately. And so how are we going to address that and ensure that rights aren't being implicated in ways we don't feel comfortable with? What is the oversight of the AI going to be? So, if an AI makes a decision, is there going to be the capability to question that decision? Is there going to be a capability to explain how that decision was made, right? So like how we get there is going to be very important. So it's really raising all of those questions and trying to flesh out how we're going to approach that. But AI itself is so new that it's going to be really interesting to see how this evolves, because I think we all think we understand it, but then when we see it in action, it's going to be quite interesting what AI can actually do.
I think that's really the big thing, right? We don't fully understand what the implications of AI are. But to me, one of the things that really pops out is the way AI would normally end up working. And I say this across the board for the most part, is by feeding it data. And that the implication of that is the question of bias, which I want to get into in a few seconds. But let me ask, from the perspective of a privacy lawyer, who owns the data that gets fed into the AI? And the result that comes out. And the reason I asked that question is there was a recent IP decision where I think it was around patents, if I remember correctly, but the AI invented it. And the question is, who owns that patent?
And that's an unknown. That is a great call out. So there's two call outs. So you sort of touched on the IP one, which is if AI creates an invention, who owns it? Is it the person who stood up the original AI? Is it the AI itself? Can AI own a patent though? These start to ask questions of like, what does it mean to be someone with rights? We really get into this very abstract, almost like science fiction type of questions that we're going to start asking. But on the privacy side, there are some real questions, because often, like you said, AI is modules that are trained on data. So I am training on data. Now, presumably, once I train it on that data, I no longer need that data. So could I delete that data, or does that break the AI? So that's one question. And then how do I train it on that data in a way that doesn't violate someone's privacy rights? So do we feel that users, so typically in the current world, I get consent for the collection of your data. I use it for the reason why I collected it. And then that secondary use might be to create these models off of the AI and sort of build those. Well, using it in that way, is that going to violate my privacy rights? Do I have a lawful basis to be using it that way? And I want to call attention to a recent FTC case against EverAlbum, which it's a photo sharing application, and they were using people's photos to create the models that were then going to be used to sort of improve their services. What was really interesting about the FTC case, so we had the typical issues with transparency and a failure to tell individuals what was going on. That's pretty, I don't want to say it's standard, but that's not shocking, right? We see that a lot from FTC. It's the unfair and deceptive trade practices. But what was more interesting is that they, as part of the settlement decree, not only did they have to delete the data of the individuals, they had to delete the models that were built off of that data. That's literally requiring you to delete a business asset. So the question becomes, and I think what's unexplored yet, and will be something that we definitely are going to be looking at in the next week or so, is how does the GDPR and this proposed regulation live in the same universe? And do we feel that there is going to be a way to, one, both uphold the GDPR, which has the data privacy protections, which gives all these data rights, but also allow, specifically in the EU, where this is relevant, AI to succeed and to be used and to grow and to develop, knowing that we're going to have to use data that's probably impacted by the GDPR. That's an unknown. And I think that's going to be something that's going to be really challenging in the EU market, and could potentially hinder the EU's market growth in AI, which I know is what they're trying to avoid. But it's definitely a very interesting conversation to be aware of as we see more of this AI get discussed.
Which is really interesting to me, because right now we're focused on this perspective of AI as a developing concept. What I think is even more interesting, and can we delete models as business assets, or the rights to the actual privacy rights and stuff like that go along with it. But as we get closer and closer towards sentience, and we get closer and closer to the idea that AI itself has its own rights, if you will, for lack of a better term. Obviously, there are IP rights that go along with it. But more importantly, can you delete someone's memories? And the someone being the AI in this case. And there's some sci-fi implications, which we're probably 30 years away from it, or 20 years.
In my head, I was like, Black Mirror, like you're going to do an episode on this probably. But it does, I mean, so, let's look at the GDPR. The GDPR applies to a natural person. Okay.
Yep.
So presumably AI would not have GDPR rights, because a natural person is, well, presumably a person. But that is something that, I think while not heavily relevant in today's world, because I think that it's so far beyond what 90% of the companies are doing. I know there's probably about 10% that actually are like, this is highly relevant to what I'm doing. I might be too scared to look into those 10%. I think it is an interesting question. I think it's an interesting question as technology evolves and grows, and who we are as individuals becomes more and more tied with technology, and sort of we have this merger. What does it mean to have a natural person? And when when does that merge so completely? You know, like my phone isn't me, but some days it feels like it's me.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
because it's literally my vehicle to the world, and it's like my sole source of communication sometimes, and especially, you know, during the current pandemic environment. So you do start to wonder that, and it's kind of cool and fun to be in this area because you get to ask those questions when we don't have the answers, and we just sort of get to think about, what do we want society to look like in 30, 40, 50 years? What are the societal norms that we're okay giving up to get the benefit of AI?
So let's take that second question and I got to the sci-fi question because I couldn't resist going there. But let's start with the stuff where we are right now, which is the issue of bias. Well, before we get into the issue of bias, because again, that's a whole rabbit hole. Let's address the big famous thing that came out from this proposed AI guidance. Again, proposed regulation, essentially coming out saying that we don't want to get into government surveillance, and government surveillance is going to be one of the things that's not allowed using AI. I guess the question would be, first of all, what is your take on it? And secondly, whatever your take, how does that position the EU to somewhere like China, where they're actively going and saying we want to use AI for government surveillance? I think one of my favorite bits of news that came out in a very Black Mirror kind of way was yesterday's news that that China wants people. They came out with an app, I think, that said if someone you know is not does not believe in the party in the right way, report them here. And what does AI do with that? So just love to get your comments on that to start off with.
Yeah. So, you know, a little bit on the EU and the EU legal system. And I think this is important to recognize when we're talking about government surveillance. So government surveillance is usually a police power or a national security power. Under the way the EU system works, that is not an EU authority, or an EU competency is what they call it within the EU legal system. So that rests with the member states. So each member state is going to have its own authority to conduct surveillance, its own authority to use its police powers, as especially in the national security context. Now, there is certainly collaboration and cooperation between the EU member states. There's also collaboration and cooperation with EU member states and non-EU member states, you know, many partners that they have across the entire globe. So because of that, it's a really interesting question, because we're going to have this AI Act, and they have the EU has no authority to dictate how the member states are going to use AI in their surveillance or in their police enforcement powers. So that's going to just be carved out. Whether or not the EU member states agree to something of their own volition to either restrict their ability to use AI or, you know, permit AI in certain contexts, et cetera, is going to be a completely separate conversation. It might happen under some EU guidance, but it has nothing to do with EU law. So I think that's a really interesting point. And I think for a lot of individuals who are not sitting in Europe, it's really important when we're looking at proposed laws, when we're looking at different areas that these laws could impact, understanding what is under the EU authority and what is completely outside of the EU authority. And anything to do with national security, policing, et cetera, that's all going to rest with each member state. And that's actually been an interesting, not criticism per se, but, you know, in light of the Schrems II decision last year, where there was a lot of emphasis placed on the EU or the US surveillance laws and the way in which they collect data, you know, the US has in recent months sort of turned around and said, hey, you member states, you're doing the same thing and you just fall outside of the GDPR because it's a national security and you're outside of the GDPR. So it's really, that's an interesting conversation, not on point with what you were saying, but I just think it's really interesting. We have to recognize that surveillance is happening, how it's happening, how aggressively it's happening, the tools that are being used. That is certainly deviated from across the globe, like all these different countries look at it differently. I think where AI has some of the most scary capacities is when we're dealing with mass surveillance in the sense of just collecting information that's running on the cables. and not necessarily collecting it with a targeted purpose, right? So if you're collecting someone's email account, we're not going to need AI for that, right? We have a subpoena, we're going to go after it, we're going to get that information. What's scary with AI is that any practice by any country where they are just mass collecting data that's running on these underground cables across the Atlantic, now all of a sudden we might have a capability to understand that data at a level that we never did before. And in certain countries, that's a very scary proposition. You named one of them that might take more action than we would feel comfortable with. But it's certainly something that is to be watched to see how the technologies evolve that are going to allow us to harness the data more. Now, I do want to point out, in addition to like mass surveillance, so we have surveillance from a state perspective, right? State surveillance. But let's not forget, some of the largest databases on us, some of the strongest information dossiers that they have on us are sitting with Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Twitter, et cetera. So the question becomes too, is it more dangerous for AI to be in their hands or in the state's hands? And I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. But I think it's an interesting question.
Which to me raises the question of, have they defined the word surveillance here? And what I mean by that is there's the obvious security aspect of surveillance. But what happens if surveillance is around, did you step out of your house and therefore spread the COVID virus? And you had Israel basically come out and say that you can have our data if you are willing to invest into Israel, because they consider themselves, I think the term they used was the entrepreneurial nation, I believe is what they coined the term for themselves. But my question is, the moment you have that data out there and you have AI using that data, the EU is basically saying, we aren't going to let you use that for quote unquote mass surveillance. But what if that mass surveillance is something that a lot of people agree is for the public good? And I don't mean security, I mean health. How does that play itself out? Or do we not know yet?
That's a really good question. I think it's something that in the pandemic we've had to really think about at a much deeper level. There's a couple of levels to that. So one is, do we feel confident that we can ask society to consent to them? Do we feel confident that we'll know what we're consenting to? I would question no. I don't even know what I would be consenting to. And I think I probably have more knowledge in this than maybe the average, societal member. The other, aspect of it is, what happens to that data when it's no longer quote unquote valuable for the reason for why it was collected? That's where actually I think more of this becomes an issue, because I think for many, collecting my data to confirm if I was in a grocery store when somebody else was there who then had a confirmed case of COVID, I bet for many people they'd be willing for the trade-off, or they would at least consider the trade-off of, you knew I was in that grocery store, but now I have this benefit. It's the fact that you probably are going to know that in about 10 years because you didn't delete that data. And we're really bad at deleting and destroying data because we have this thought that there's going to be, this euphoric moment when all data becomes extremely valuable and I can, monetize it, et cetera. So, I think there's a lot of levels to that. For most companies, though, putting aside some very sophisticated companies, for most companies, they've got a lot of data. They have no idea what to do with it. And they're probably never going to be able to maximize it. And then by the time the technology rolls around to the, mid-sized market, that data is going to be old and out of date. So I think it's realistically, we're not going to see a ton of companies be able to turn this into sort of this market type of approach. But the few and far between that are there should be considered for sure.
I want to be respectful of time. I know you have a deadline. Just
as always, like any lawyer, I live in deadlines. So.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. So before we sort of start concluding, what is one question you'd like the audience to answer for us in the comments?
I guess I would ask, in the last week, what was your biggest technology concern? I would be curious about that because we're going back to work in person, maybe not, maybe this hybrid. So there's some concerns around that. I think there's been some influential decisions. We'd have some interesting dialogue out of our federal government around solar winds, some other, critical infrastructure. So I'd be curious to know, what keeps you up at night? What's that technology topic, privacy, security, however you want to phrase it, that you're interested in and you're focusing on currently?
So I'll answer it for myself because I
Mhm.
think it's important to make myself the first person on there. For me, it was I've been watching a lot of Netflix, and I landed up watching the show on Cambridge Analytica. They had a little thing on what actually happened and what the implications of that were. And I interviewed a really interesting behavioral scientist, and I thought the implication of that combined with mass surveillance, combined with data privacy, is the area that I'm most concerned of which direction we're going, because I like to think of myself as either contrarian or I make decisions for myself, and to realize that I'm so susceptible is problematic. So that would be my sort of self-analysis moment, if you will, for lack of a better term. What was yours?
It's really interesting you say that, because I was just talking about this. How do we know that we're the one making the decision?
Yeah.
And that's what really came out of a lot of the documentary that you're speaking on, but a lot of other conversations, which is, did I want to buy that on Amazon, or was I convinced to buy that on Amazon? Like, do you start to question your own knowledge base, et cetera? Yeah, it's definitely, that is top of mind. And I think everyone thinks I'm smart enough. I would never be the one that would be impacted by that. But guess what? We all are. At varying levels, but we all are sort of susceptible to that, and they're so good at the behavioral component. It's quite fascinating. I think for me, there's twofold. I think from a business perspective, I think we just constantly see this struggle with the globalization of data privacy and security, and how to address this in a business friendly manner. I have so many clients that I feel like they feel like there's no right answer. They're in Pandora's box. They need to stand up 20 different privacy programs because there's 20 different laws that impact them. And so finding the consistencies, finding the synergies, that's where a lot of the work is, in making sure it works for their business. And that to me is one of the most critical aspects from a business perspective. And then now we're seeing different states, adopt laws. So not only do I have global laws, but I've got to deal with Virginia, California. I think Florida might adopt, or maybe just adopted theirs. There's so many different laws, it feels overwhelming. So oftentimes it's just breaking it down into a manageable, digestible way of looking at privacy and security. It's really hard. And that's what really our team constantly is working on, trying out ways to communicate this in a way that doesn't seem as daunting. But it's hard to do when there's like a new law every day. Thank you, EU, even yesterday. And then from a personal perspective, I think the use of media and social media and different platforms around, information that's being told out there, misinformation, and how we know what we're reading online is real. That to me is unsolved. And I even question myself, like, is this a real video? Is this a real clip that's taken from someone talking? Has it been, deep faked, et cetera? And that's more on the personal side of me looking and sort of, I like to read a lot. I like to stay up to date on the news, and I'm very cautious as to where I feel comfortable getting my news from. I'm looking at the domains. I'm confirming it on multiple sites. It feels like I have to go and do my own news brief in order to feel comfortable. And I don't know where that's going to go. And I don't know what to tell people, how to feel comfortable with what they're seeing online is in fact authentic and real.
It's interesting you say that. I actually have a friend who I've interviewed on here. His name's Jim Nasser, and Jim is working with a couple of companies on trying to identify fake news and what are the implications of that, because he's coming at it from a distributed ledger technology, blockchain type of perspective. Yep. So how do you do that, and the validity of it and all that good stuff? So stay tuned. Hopefully it's an issue we can go after. On the other hand, I wonder if that's a problem that AI can help solve as we continue.
Maybe. AI will, save the world. Maybe. I have no idea.
Fair enough. during this podcast, I do want to sort of do a quick recap. We landed up talking about what is artificial intelligence. We talked a little bit about, and we never quite got to the topic of bias, which I really, really want to get into. But I also want to talk about it really in the context of bias, but also weight of the information.
Mm-hmm.
So how does AI weigh information? And obviously it's determined by models and stuff like that. But I just think it's an interesting topic. We talked a little bit about not just what is it, but we gave a little bit of a definition of the lack of specific scope and the amorphous nature of it right now. But he talked about the actual legal ramifications, whether we're talking about loans, whether we're talking about employment. We talked about the basics, the distinction between directives and regulations. We then got into just whether the directives and the regulations can be influenced in their version of a notice and comment period. We talked about how these can be influenced to lobbyists as well. You made brief mention of the Everalbum case, and we talked a little bit about AI sentience for a second. We then got into AI ownership in terms of who responds, who engages, who owns the data. We talked a little bit about cybersecurity in the context of AI, in the context of data. We talked about AI oversight, and we talked about member states versus individual companies, if you will, and if one's better or worse. We also talked about surveillance, and we spoke primarily about police surveillance, but we also talked a little bit about healthcare and life sciences and health surveillance, and what are the implications of that. I really wanted to get a little bit more into, can you actually end up doing a clinical trial in a scenario where you're just doing surveillance anyways? So do you actually need the study anymore, or is it all quote unquote real world evidence? But did I miss anything?
No, and I will say, well, I'll have to come back on and talk about that real world evidence, but that is a hard sell right now. So
I definitely want to have you come back on and talk about that. One question, where can they find you if they want to talk to you?
So you can connect with me on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and you can also find me at my law firm website, which is www.beckage.com. We put out a lot of helpful content there, blogs on a lot of these topics we talked about today, and a ton of other ones. So definitely check that out.
Just to be clear, nothing in this podcast should be construed as legal or clinical advice of any kind. It's intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you like this podcast, please leave a comment, please subscribe. You can find me at DarshanTalks on Twitter, or go to our website at DarshanTalks.com. Jordan, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was great.